In February 1968, during the chaos of the Tet Offensive, a Huey pilot flying a resupply run over a stretch of jungle west of Khe Sanh radioed in something that should not exist in any transcript, and doesn't because the transcript was pulled the same night. That pilot's name, according to declassified personnel rosters cross-referenced by an independent researcher in 2011, was Warrant Officer Daniel Reyes Holloway. He flew 2 tours, he came home, and for 41 years he told almost no one what he saw on the night of February the 9th, until a hospice nurse in Tucson, Arizona, sat beside his bed in the last week of his life and turned on a small cassette recorder, because she had done this before with other veterans, and she had learned that some men need to say the thing out loud before they can stop carrying it. That recording surfaced in 2013. It was donated, along with a shoebox of Holloway's personal effects, to a small oral history archive attached to a Veterans Outreach Center in Tucson. It sat there, uncatalogued, for 6 years. A volunteer archivist named Miriam Costas found it in 2019 while digitizing donated tapes, and what she heard in the first 11 minutes made her stop the project she was working on and listen to the whole thing twice before she told anyone. Holloway begins on the tape by describing the mission as routine. He says that word twice, routine, a resupply flight, ammunition, and medical crates, standard low-altitude approach along a corridor his unit had flown a dozen times that month. He says the jungle canopy that night was unusually dark, no moon, cloud cover thick enough that he was flying mostly on instruments and memory. And then, he says, his door gunner, a young specialist he refers to only as Petrosky, started shouting over the intercom about a light on the ground. Not artillery, not tracer fire. He's specific about this on the tape, almost defensive about it, as though he anticipated being told he'd mistaken a flare or a downed aircraft burning. It didn't flicker, he says. It didn't move like fire moves. It was steady, and it was blue-white, and it was coming from a clearing that Holloway swears was not on any map he'd flown that corridor with. He banked the helicopter to get a better look, against his own instincts, against what training told him to do in a hot zone at night, and what he saw in that clearing for maybe 4 or 5 seconds before the cloud cover closed back over the moonlight was a shape resting at an angle in the wet grass. Not a helicopter, not wreckage from a fixed-wing aircraft. He describes it, haltingly, as looking like 2 shallow bowls pressed together at the rim, maybe 25 feet across, tilted so that one edge had dug into the earth. And standing near it, illuminated by that same blue-white light, were figures. He says 3, though he corrects himself once on the tape, and says he's only certain of 2. Too thin, he says, not wearing anything he recognized as a uniform, and the proportions were wrong in a way he says he still can't fully articulate, even now, even at the end of his life, even after 4 decades of turning it over. The heads were too large for the frames beneath them. Petrosky saw it too. Holloway is emphatic about this because he says for years he wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing, and the only thing that kept him from writing it off entirely was that Petrosky, independently, in a debrief the following week that Holloway wasn't present for, apparently said something similar enough that it reached Holloway secondhand through a mutual friend in the unit. Holloway never spoke to Petrosky about it directly. He says on the tape that he tried once in 1971, and Petrosky changed the subject so fast and so completely that Holloway understood the conversation was closed permanently. Here's where the account becomes difficult to verify, and, I think, more interesting because of it. Holloway says he radioed a contact report immediately, standard procedure for any unidentified activity near a flight corridor. He gave coordinates. He described, in the clipped shorthand of a wartime radio transmission, an unidentified object and unidentified personnel in a jungle clearing. He says the response from base was immediate silence, followed roughly 90 seconds later by an unfamiliar voice cutting into the frequency and telling him to disregard, maintain course, and report to a specific tent immediately upon landing. That was not his usual debrief location. He landed. He went to the tent. Two men in unmarked fatigues, he says, neither of whom he ever saw again during his remaining tour, asked him to describe exactly what he'd seen, wrote almost nothing down, and told him that the incident had already been explained, that it was a downed reconnaissance drone with an unusual thermal signature, and that any further discussion of it with anyone, including Petrovsky, would constitute a serious violation. He signed something. He doesn't remember what. He says that's the part that bothers him most, even now, not the shape in the clearing. The fact that he signed a document at 23 years old that he cannot recall the content of, and that no version of it has ever surfaced in any records request filed by any researcher who has looked. Because researchers have looked. In 2015, after the tape began circulating in a small community of Vietnam-era UFO investigators, a man named Curtis Whelan filed a Freedom of Information Act request for any incident reports connected to Holloway's unit near Khe Sanh in the second week of February 1968. What came back after an 18-month wait was a standard operational log with that specific night's resupply mission listed, timestamps intact, but the narrative field, the section where a pilot would note anything unusual encountered in flight, was blank, not redacted, not blacked out with the heavy bars you see in other declassified documents. Blank, as though nothing had ever been written there at all. Whelan found this more unsettling than a redaction would have been, and I understand why. A redaction tells you something was there, and someone decided you couldn't see it. A blank field tells you nothing was ever allowed to exist in the first place. There's a second piece of this that Holloway only mentions once, near the end of the recording, almost as an afterthought, in the tone of a man who has decided he's already said the difficult part, and this last detail barely matters anymore. He says that 11 days after the incident, his unit received a new pilot, a replacement, mid-tour, which he says was unusual but not unheard of. The new pilot, he says, was assigned specifically to his aircraft and flew with him for the remainder of his rotation on that corridor. Holloway never learned why, and when he asked his commanding officer, he was told the reassignment was administrative and not to be questioned further. He says he always wondered if the new pilot had been placed there to watch him. He never had proof. He just had the feeling, he says, that settled into him sometime in March of 1968 and never entirely left. Miriam Costas, the archivist who found the tape, tried to locate a service record for Petrovsky to see if any account existed independently of Holloway's memory. She found a partial personnel listing, a specialist with that surname assigned to a unit in the same operational area during that period, but no discharge record, no post-service address, nothing that would let her reach out and ask him directly. Whether that's simply the ordinary erosion of 50-year-old paperwork or something else, she says she can't determine, and she's careful in the notes she left with the donated materials not to claim more than the evidence supports. But Costas didn't stop there, and this is where the story widens into something I did not expect when I first started pulling on this thread. In the same shoebox of Holloway's effects, beneath a set of dog tags and a folded letter to a sister he'd apparently never sent, she found a single sheet of yellow legal paper, undated, covered in Holloway's handwriting, that appeared to be notes for a conversation he never had. Not a letter, not a diary entry, a list, almost, of things he wanted to say to someone, someday, if the moment ever presented itself. Near the bottom of that page, underlined twice, are 5 words. Ask Reyes what he carried. Costas spent the better part of a year trying to determine who Reyes was. She worked through unit unit rosters, casualty lists, veteran outreach databases, cold calling numbers that led nowhere, or to disconnected lines, or to families who had never heard the name in connection with their relative. In late 2020, she found him, not through official channels, but through a Facebook group for helicopter crew veterans of the 1st Cavalry Division, where a man named Arturo Reyes, living at the time in Corpus Christi, Texas, occasionally posted photographs of restored aircraft parts and short-clipped comments about his service that never went into detail. Costas messaged him. She says the first 3 messages went unanswered, the 4th, in which she mentioned Holloway by name, and the date, February the 9th, 1968, got a response within an hour. Reyes agreed to speak with her, but only by phone, and only, he said, once. He didn't want a recording made. He didn't want his name published. Costas honored the first request in spirit, but kept detailed notes during the call, which she later shared, with Reyes's reluctant permission, granted shortly before his own death in 2022, as part of the archive materials connected to Holloway's tape. Reyes had not been on Holloway's aircraft that night. He had been on the ground. He was part of a 6-man perimeter security detail that Costas says was dispatched, according to Reyes, sometime after 0300 hours on the morning of February the 10th, to a coordinate that matched almost exactly the location Holloway had radioed in. Reyes told her he didn't know, at the time, what the mission was. He was told it was a downed aircraft recovery, standard procedure, secure the site until an extraction team arrived. What he found, he said, was not standard, and was not, in his words, an aircraft in any sense he understood the word. He described the same tilted, bowl-shaped form Holloway had described from the air, resting in a clearing surrounded by trampled grass and scorched vegetation, in a radius he estimated at perhaps 60 feet. He said the 6 men were ordered to hold a perimeter facing outward, away from the object, and were explicitly told not to look at it directly, an order he said struck him as strange at the time, and stranger the longer he thought about it in the years afterward. Why would a command tell you not to look at wreckage? Wreckage is what you're there to secure. You look at wreckage, you don't look away from it. He said he broke that order once, for perhaps 2 seconds, turning his head enough to see, in the gray pre-dawn light, 2 men in what he described as unmarked containment suits, not standard chemical protection gear, something he'd never seen before or since, moving something between them on a low stretcher toward a waiting vehicle that was not a standard military transport. He said the shape on the stretcher was covered, and he said the covering did not lie flat the way a covering lies over an ordinary human form. He would not elaborate further. Costas asked him twice, gently, what he meant by that, and both times he changed the subject, the same way, she notes, that Petrosky had reportedly changed the subject with Holloway in 1971. A closed door, opened once by 2 seconds of forbidden curiosity, and then shut for the rest of a lifetime. Reyes told her that within a week of the incident, his entire 6-man detail was quietly redistributed to different units across different provinces, not court-martialed, not punished, exactly. Scattered, he said, the way you'd scatter something you didn't want reassembled. He said he never again served alongside any of the other 5 men from that perimeter detail, and that over the following decades, he lost track of all but one, a man he believed had died in the mid-1990s in Oregon, cause unknown to him. This is the detail that, for me, transforms the story from a single uncorroborated deathbed account into something considerably harder to dismiss. 2 men on 2 different nights, within hours of each other, in 2 entirely different roles, one in the air and one on the ground, independently described the same shape, the same location, the same pattern of official erasure, and neither of them, as far as any researcher has been able to determine, ever spoke to the other about it, ever knew of the other's account or had any opportunity to coordinate a story. Holloway's tape was recorded in 2009. Reyes's account was given to Costas in 2020, 11 years apart. No contact between the two men that anyone has found. And yet the details align in ways that are difficult to explain as coincidence, chance overlap, or the ordinary contamination that spreads through veteran communities over decades of retellings. Whelan, the researcher who filed the original FOIA request, went back in 2021 with a second, narrower request, this time asking specifically for any personnel transfer records connected to a 6-man security detail reassigned out of the operational area in question during the 3rd week of February 1968. The response took over 2 years. What came back was, once again, technically complete and functionally empty. A cover memo confirming that transfer orders existed for 6 enlisted personnel during that window, followed by a note stating that the underlying documentation had been administratively consolidated in 1979 and was no longer separately retrievable. Whelan says he has never, in over a decade of filing similar requests connected to other incidents, seen that specific phrase used in a response, administratively consolidated. He says it means nothing and everything at once. It is the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug, official enough to close a request, vague enough to explain away as ordinary record-keeping, and impossible to challenge because there is nothing left to challenge. I want to be careful here, the way I try to be careful with every account like this. Holloway was dying when he made that recording, and memory under those conditions, softened by morphine, compressed by 41 years of silence, is not a clean instrument. Reyes was speaking secondhand, decades removed, to a stranger on the phone, describing 2 seconds of a forbidden glance in the gray light before dawn. Neither account, on its own, would hold up as proof of anything, but taken together, alongside a blank field in an operational log, alongside a phrase like administratively consolidated appearing in an official response, alongside a scattered security detail that never reassembled and rarely spoke of what scattered them, a pattern begins to take a shape of its own. Not proof, a shape, the outline of something that happened, traced entirely by the specific ways in which the world afterward tried to make sure it hadn't. There is one more thread in this story, and I hesitated for a long time before including it because it comes from a source I cannot independently verify, and Costas herself treats with visible caution in her notes. In 2021, after a short piece about Holloway's tape appeared on a small aviation history forum, Costas received an email from a man who identified himself only as a retired signals technician stationed during 1968 at a communications relay post roughly 40 miles from the corridor Holloway flew. He would not give his name. He would not agree to a phone call. Everything that follows comes from 4 emails exchanged over the course of about 3 weeks before he stopped responding entirely. He wrote that on the night in question, or what he believed was the night in question based on the date Costas had mentioned in the forum post, he was on duty monitoring a range of frequencies that included the one Holloway's aircraft would have used. He wrote that he remembered the exchange, or something like it, not because of its content, which he says was brief and procedural on the surface, but because of what happened immediately afterward. He says a supervisor he had never seen at that post before or since arrived within minutes, physically removed the reel of tape from the recording equipment himself, and told the technician on duty that the equipment had malfunctioned and that no incident had occurred that night worth logging. He says he was reassigned to a different shift rotation less than 2 weeks later, a transfer he was told was routine and never questioned again, not because he believed it, he wrote, but because by then he understood questioning it would accomplish nothing except drawing attention to the fact that he remembered. remembered. Kostas cannot confirm this man's identity, his unit, or even that he was where he claims to have been. She notes, fairly, that anonymous corroboration is barely corroboration at all, that it is easy for a story to attract embellishment once it begins circulating, and that she has learned over years of this work to hold such messages loosely as texture rather than evidence. But she also notes, and I think this is worth sitting with, that the detail he described, a supervisor physically removing a tape and citing equipment malfunction, is a strange thing for someone to invent if their aim were simply to insert themselves into a story that had already found a small audience. It is not a dramatic detail. It is a mundane one, procedural, almost boring, and it is precisely the kind of mundane detail that Kostas says she has come to trust more than the vivid ones, because the vivid ones are what people embellish, and the boring ones are usually what people remember because they actually happened. What we're left with is a dying man's voice on a cassette tape, a blank field in an otherwise complete operational log, a replacement pilot whose assignment was never explained, a door gunner who closed a conversation in 1971 and never reopened it, a ground soldier who saw something on a stretcher that did not lie flat the way a human body lies flat, and a six-man detail scattered to the winds within a week and never reassembled. None of it proves what came down in that clearing outside Khe Sanh, but it describes a pattern that shows up again and again in accounts like this one. Not a cover-up in the dramatic sense, not men in a room deciding to lie. Something quieter, a blank space where a record should be, a silence that gets treated eventually as though it was always there. Holloway died 6 days after that recording was made. Kostas says the nurse who taped the conversation told her that in his final days, he seemed calmer than he had been in weeks, as though the telling itself had done something the 41 years of silence hadn't. He never said what he thought the figures in that clearing were. He only ever said what he saw and let the listener decide the rest. Reyes died 2 years after speaking to Kostas in the spring of 2022, and as far as she has been able to determine, he never spoke of that night to anyone else. Not his wife, not his children, not in the hundreds of comments he left over the years on photographs of restored helicopter parts, admiring in public the machines that had carried him towards something he would spend the rest of his life declining to fully describe. I keep coming back to one line near the end of Holloway's tape, where his voice is barely audible and the nurse has to ask him to repeat it. He says, "I don't know what we were supposed to forget. I just know we were supposed to." And then the tape runs another 40 seconds of silence before it ends. I think about that silence more than almost anything else in this account, because it is, in its own way, the most honest 40 seconds on the entire recording. Not an answer, not a confession, just a man who had carried something for 41 years, finally setting it down, and finding that even once it was said out loud, there was nothing more underneath it to say. What was in that clearing outside Khe Sanh in February of 1968? What did not lie flat beneath a covering on a low stretcher in the gray light before dawn? And why, more than half a century later, does the paper trail meant to explain it away keep dissolving, gently, bureaucratically, into phrases that mean nothing and everything at once, the moment anyone tries to hold it up to the light?